Hello, everyone. My name is Louisa Crane, and I am the program coordinator at the Knox-Lincoln Soil and Water Conservation District. Today, our program manager, Rebecca Jacobs, and I will be sharing with you some important information about invasive terrestrial plants impacting Maine's forests. We'll start with kind of an overview of what an invasive plant, what that means, and then go through a series of 10 species that you should be on the lookout for, and talk a little bit about management as well. So a little bit about us, just really briefly. We are one of 16 soil and water conservation districts across the state of Maine. Our mission is to provide assistance in the conservation of soil and water resources for our community through proactive efforts, actions, and education. We are technically a quasi-governmental agency, and we are non-regulatory. So we do a lot of outreach and education, as well as some technical assistance as well. And you can learn more about us on our website, knox-lincoln.org. where there's a lot more about all the different kinds of programs that we offer. First, we're going to just define what is an invasive species, because the term invasive does get thrown around a lot, and we also hear terms like native, non-native, weed, even to describe plants. So we want to just be really clear on what kinds of plants we're talking about so that you understand the problems that these plants can really cause. So an invasive species is one that is not native to a region and causes harm to the environment, human health, or human economic resources. And I think that it's important to note also that a lot of times these negative impacts go hand in hand. So especially in, for example, a forestry context, the ecological harm that invasive plants cause may also very well have a human economic harm associated with it as well. So that is definitely one thing to keep in mind. When we're talking about invasive plants, we can kind of split them up into these two groups of widespread invasive species and early detection, rapid response invasive species. So the management approaches are going to be different depending on what species you have at hand, not just in terms of how widespread it is, but also, you know, whether it's an annual or a tree. This is really going to impact management. And so we're going to talk a little bit about management more at the end of this presentation. And I'd also like to just talk about how these species are really impacting forests specifically. The biggest thing would just be with forest regeneration. So these species are shade tolerant and they can easily invade a forest understory. So the very clear connection is that they prevent the small little tree seedlings from really thriving, but they have much far-reaching impacts as well on forests. So they change the entire kind of structure of the forest. They decrease the biodiversity a lot, and so you'll have just an understory full of these plants, and it'll be really monotonous in terms of just the kinds of habitats that are available to our native species. And not to mention that they don't provide the same nutritional value or food for our native fauna either. So yeah, there's a lot going on here with the invasive species, and they can really, really impact just the entire way that your forest ecosystem functions in a really negative way. Moving on to just trying to drill in this idea of invasive species by showing some plants that are not invasive in Maine really briefly before we move into our focused species that we want to cover today. So you'll see poison ivy at the top left. This is a native species to Maine, so by definition, it can't be invasive. And actually, it has a lot of really awesome wildlife properties or value. So yeah, you might be thinking about managing this species in certain areas where there's a lot of high human foot traffic. but the management approach is going to be a lot different than it will be for plants that are actually invasive. Yeah, I showed the staghorn sumac, which sometimes people throw out there as, oh, it's so invasive, but actually this is a native species. Its growth habit, it tends to form these clonal colonies through vegetative reproduction, so by sending up suckers, and so people will see big swaths of it along the roadside, for example, and be like, oh, it's so invasive. But really, this is just the growth habit of this plant, and it's native, and it has some really awesome wildlife properties, and it's particularly great in kind of an edge habitat area. So yeah, this is a cool one, not invasive, native. The two on the right, however, these are not native, but and oftentimes people will think of them as weeds. So we have the common dandelion and broadleaf plantain. These are not native. However, they're also not invasive because they just don't have the same major ecological and economic impacts that the invasive species that we're going to talk about today have. So yes, some people might consider them weeds in certain contexts, but they are not invasive. So now we're going to move into our invasive species that we're highlighting today. The first is Asiatic Bittersweet. This is a woody vine, and it can girdle and smother large trees. So it likes to kind of wrap its way around a tree and make its way up to the top of the canopy, but it also will happily smother shorter vegetation as well. Basically, it just wants light, and it will try to climb up whatever it can to get that light. So yeah, you'll see in this photo, it is climbing up the birch tree, and there's very little vegetation on the bittersweet down low. There's not a lot of light that's penetrating down here, but I'm sure there's a lot of leaves belonging to that bittersweet up high. And then this is an edge habitat. You'll see it just creates this wall of leaves up and down. There are some trees in there. It needs trees to, it wouldn't just be growing like this. It needs something to support it. So yeah, so that is what Asiatic bittersweet can look like on the edge of a wooded area. Moving into leaf shape, this can sometimes be a little bit confusing for people first learning to identify Asiatic bittersweet because the leaf shape can vary a little bit. They can vary from being rounder to being a little bit more pointed, like these ones on the right. The color looks different in these photos, but that's actually more to do with just the lighting. But yeah, I think you can focus on the leaf margins being a little bit wavy, and you have these leaves are about 2 to 4 inches long. So the size and this leaf margin, and that they're arranged opposite each other, excuse me, not opposite, alternate, not opposite. So they're arranged alternate on the stems or on the vine. So the next thing to look at is actually the color of the roots on this plant. They have these very distinctly orange tinted roots. This is a clump of little seedlings that I pulled and took a picture of. I wanted to make sure to get those roots in the picture to just really show this is Asiatic bittersweet. So that can be a really helpful kind of confirming ID feature. Once you see it above ground, you could pull it and just be like, I'm right, it was Asiatic bittersweet. Yeah, and so thinking about the fruit, I'm not highlighting the flowers today just because they are a little bit nondescript, but the fruit, it jumps out a lot more. By fall, you'll have these really obvious kind of yellow orange fruit all along, not just at the ends of the vines, but all along. And then even later in the fall, those orange or yellow casings like open up to reveal these really bright red fruits. So they're very distinctive at that time of year. Yeah, so that's Asiatic bittersweet. It is quite widespread. It's definitely not an early detection, early response species. It is a widespread species. Next, we have another widespread species, Japanese barberry. I'd like to point you to this photo on the bottom first. It's a dense woody shrub with lots and lots of arching spiny branches, and they are very spiny. This is a close-up of one of the spines. So I would not want to wrap my hand around this plant right here. You can see the little spines. So that is definitely a helpful ID feature, but also just looking at how distinct this plant is. All these little leaves that are technically alternate, but really look like they're just gathered in little clusters on like the top of the stems or the branches. So you can see they're kind of growing from they're on the top, and they'll have these flowers that hang down and then develop into these ovoid red fruit in fall. And these fruit also will stick on for a good part of the winter as well. Yeah, so this is a very shade tolerant plant. It can definitely infiltrate or invade a forest understory. And it is also linked to increased tick populations. So this is just one more reason why you don't want this plant in your woods. So moving on to actually the one tree that we're featuring today, Norway maple. So this tree has significant impacts on forests, and I'm going to focus on how to differentiate it from sugar maple, because that is the species that is most often confused with the Norway maple. However, once you take a closer look, they're actually quite different. So I'm going to point out some of the differences and also highlight differences that you can see at different times of the year and at different life stages of the plant. So the first thing is just looking at the leaf shape. Of course, they're both going to have those signature palmate maple-like leaves. But if you look closer, they're definitely a little bit different. Generally, the Norway maple is going to have larger leaves than the sugar maple, but of course they're plants and there is variation in leaf size among individuals and within the same individual. So that's not always a hard and fast rule. You could very easily find a Norway maple leaf that's smaller than a sugar maple leaf, but it's a general rule of thumb. There's also going to be kind of more, if you imagine that these are fingers or lobes on the leaf, the Norway maple tends to have closer to 7, whereas the sugar maple usually just has 5 main lobes. And there's going to be more teeth on the Norway maple leaf. So yeah, so that's really helpful if you can easily see a leaf, and if you can even pick a leaf off of the tree. This is the leaf node or the leaf petiole where it meets the node, and you'll see this white sap is oozing out of the leaf petiole. So clearly that's not our sugar maple. A sugar maple has nice clear sap that we can boil down and turn into maple syrup. This milky sap is a really telltale sign that you have a Norway maple on your hands. So if you look at the terminal buds on the Norway maple, they're going to be much blunter and wider, larger, just in general. They have really prolific seeds, but not only that, they're also larger, they're flatter. So this little part is going to be flatter, whereas on the sugar maple, it's a little bit more bulbous, I guess. The seed kind of on the Norway maple kind of angles out when they hang down and they angle out, whereas with the sugar maple, they're going to be pointing down at kind of a sharper angle. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but they do look different. And yeah, in the fall, your Norway maple is going to have quite yellow looking leaves. They're going to also stay on the tree for longer than your sugar maple, which is going to have slightly more red and if not red, like orangish tints in the leaves. And so what if you can't see the leaves up close very easily? The bark of mature trees specifically can be seen as quite different on the sugar maple and the Norway maple. When they're smaller saplings, the bark looks a little bit more similar, but once they get big, there's a clear difference. So the sugar maple has a much shaggier appearance with more irregular ridges, whereas the Norway maple has kind of smoother bark and more clear, narrowly spaced ridges. So those are just some differences between the sugar maple and the Norway maple that might help you differentiate them. Our next species is garlic mustard, and this is actually an herbaceous species. It's a biennial, which means that it has a 2-year life cycle. And the first year plants look a lot different from the second year plants, and they can be a little bit trickier to identify. They form a basal rosette, so the leaves kind of all come together and meet the stem and root, and they kind of grow low to the ground. These leaves are going to be about 1 to 4 inches in diameter. These ones are probably closer to 4 inches in diameter, depending on age and environmental conditions. And they're kidney shaped, and they have these kind of wavy leaf margins. Another really helpful tool for identifying this plant actually in its first year and its second year, but also especially its first year, is its scent actually. So this species, as its name suggests, is in the mustard family, and mustard family plants tend to be quite pungent in terms of their smells. And yeah, so this one specifically, it smells like garlic or garlicky, and it actually is edible too. So that's actually why it was introduced in the first place. But yeah, so if you want, you can harvest them and saute them up. I've heard they're quite good. I've had a garlic mustard pesto myself before. But yeah, so that's one tip for IDing these first year plants. So in the second year, these little first year plants that have just been sitting there gathering up nutrients, they bolt pretty early in the season, and they go to flower, and they have these mustard-like flowers. So mustards have these 4 petals. They're white flowers, and the leaves no longer look like they did in the first year. They're no longer kind of this round kidney shape, and now they're more of an arrow-like shape. And the teeth or the leaf margins are less wavy and much more pointier teethed. So they do look quite a bit different, and they're much, much taller. So this 0.5 feet measure is just, that's not that common. They're usually around 2 to 3 feet. They can get taller up to 6 feet. But I actually have seen ones that have been mowed continuously that just happen to, eke out some flowers at just like a 6-inch height. So they can go to seed even when they're quite small. But yeah, this one, as you can see from this photo, this species can really infiltrate the understory of a forest, and it can have really severe impacts on forest regeneration. And yeah, so the flowers will then, once they're pollinated, develop into these long green seed pods that will then dry out and become brown, and they release lots and lots of seeds. So yeah, this is garlic mustard. It is one that is an early detection rapid response species. So it is not quite as widespread as barberry and bittersweet, for example, but it is definitely spreading. And this is definitely one that you really don't want. I mean, you don't want any of these species in your woodlot, but this is definitely one that you should be on the lookout for. And now we have shrubby honeysuckle. There's a few different species that are classified as invasive, but it is very widespread in Maine, and it can cause really big problems in a woodlot. You can see, I'm actually going to jump all the way over to this right hand side of the screen. You'll see it leaves out really early. compared to surrounding vegetation. Look, everything else in this photo is brown except for this forest understory that is just chock full of shrubby honeysuckle. So this spring, when you're out walking your woodlot, that's definitely something to look out for. If you have, look out for what's leafing out first, what's standing out to you, because it very well could be shrubby honeysuckle. But then, of course, you want to take a closer look and look at the leaf shape and just other features of the plant. So we have on the shrubby honeysuckle these egg-shaped or oval-shaped leaves that are opposite each other. So you can see they're arranged opposite on the branch, and the branches are thus also opposite. The leaves are not very shiny. They're kind of dull and a little bit soft, I think, personally. So they're not going to be like really stiff. So then we're looking at the bark texture of a mature plant in this picture. You can see it's super shaggy and has these very obvious like vertical texture, and it's light colored, and the roots are also relatively light colored. It is a multi-stemmed shrub, so you're not looking at a tree-shaped thing. You're looking at a plant that has multiple stems growing from the base. So then moving on to looking at the flowers, they're irregular and they are very fragrant, and they tend to attract bees, although that does not mean that you should plant it. There are many native species that attract bees that are much more favorable to have. So yeah, they have quite fragrant flowers. And in terms of the fruit, they are usually red, almost always red, but sometimes they can be orange by mid or really late summer. Shrubby honeysuckle is definitely a good example of a plant that on first glance might seem to provide wildlife value. So yeah, as I mentioned, the pollinators, especially bees, love the flowers and the fruit. The birds just devour the fruit. But it's really important to kind of not just see that as a reason to keep this plant in your woodlot or on your land. I think it's really important to take this larger context into mind when you're thinking about management. And there's been some studies that show that, for example, the fruit on the shrubby honeysuckle, even though birds like it a lot, it doesn't provide a lot of the nutritional value that our birds really need. Our native birds have co-evolved with our native flora, and so they are going to be best off feeding on native flora. Many insects need vegetation to feed on, and most of these invasive plants, or all of them, really do not provide significant food for our native insects and other fauna. So that is something to really keep in mind when thinking about these plants, that, you know, just because you see a bird eating the berries doesn't mean that you should keep the plant. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Rebecca Jacobs, Program Manager at the Knox-Lincoln Soil and Water Conservation District.
Thanks, Louisa. Yes, my name is Rebecca Jacobs, and I am the Program Manager here at Knox-Lincoln Soil Water Conservation District. Among the many hats I wear here at the district, one is for technical assistance, and the largest portion of the technical assistance I've been providing here in Knox and Lincoln counties for the past 13 years and in my career beyond has been with terrestrial invasive plants, helping people identify, map, and develop individual management plans for their properties. So the first species I'm going to talk to you about this evening is Euonymus umbellata, or autumn olive. Autumn olive is a multi-stemmed shrub that grows on average 8 to 15 feet, though given the right conditions, can be much larger than that. It flowers with a white, cream to pale yellow, tubular shaped flower with distinct four-petaled pattern, and they are fragrant. The leaves on the autumn olive are elongated. They're green on the top side of the leaves, but they are distinctly scaly and silvered on the underside. And from a distance, particularly if it's a bit breezy, that silvery underside is very distinct. They can be thorny, an average of a half to an inch long thorns. And unfortunately, the thorns are from stem to stern, as they say. So right from the tip all the way to the base, though they can be thornless. Do be aware if you're going to go in to do some cutting and removing to look for those stems before you attack the shrub. If you are looking in the late summer and into the fall, you will find a very bright red berry, but unlike honeysuckle, which is glossy red that we just saw, the autumn olives are a little bit more ovalish in shape, about a half an inch, and very silvery scaled as well. So they are also, the leaves and stems are alternately arranged on the shrub, unlike honeysuckle, which are opposite arrangement. Euonymus alatus is a shrub that I confess I used to sell in the horticultural industry when I first started a few decades back. And I've been paying the penance for ever since. This is one of the few plants in the horticultural trades, not the only, but the few that is largely sold for its fall foliage. It has beautiful kind of flaming or burning red color in the fall. In the spring, you would never buy it for its flowers. They're pale green and inconspicuous by, they're kind of overshadowed by the leaves and the structure of the plant. And they have the other common name is winged Euonymus, for the winged or corky bark that can be found sticking out or in wings along both the main and lateral stems on the plant. They also have a bright red berry that birds will eat and disperse quite readily because they don't have a great nutrition value. The next large shrub, small tree that I want to talk about is Frangula alnus, or glossy buckthorn. This is actually a thornless buckthorn, unlike common, which I'll talk about in a minute. Buckthorn can fruit and flower simultaneously. The flowers are white. The fruits can range from red to black at the same time on the same plant. They can be identified quite readily when you know for sure if you've pulled out the right plant by these blood red roots you see in the upper left hand corner of the images. Again, they're going to be in that 8 to 12 to 15 foot range on average when you're seeing sort of an understory infestation. Although they can grow into a more rounded, full tree form that would more closely resemble that of the shape of an apple, crab apple, standard apple, etc. If they are kind of on the edge of a forest or in a more open setting. They seed very prolifically, as you can see in the lower right corner. And because they have not super showy flowers, and they grow at a height similar to things like Ilex verticillata or winterberry, or the speckled alder, dogwood, which is what the leaves look most closely resemble because they have very deep, distinct venation in the leaves, as you can see in the lower left corner. they kind of go unnoticed in the landscape for a bit. And then once you kind of see far too many of them, you realize that perhaps you've got a buckthorn and not something else. If you don't have glossy buckthorn, you might have common buckthorn. It's also known as Rhamnus cathartica. The botanists have determined that they're not, in fact, as closely related as we once thought. It does have the thorns, as the name suggests. It is opposite arrangement of leaves and stems on the plant. Again, grows in that similar 8 to 12, 15 feet in height on average. But the leaves are not glossy. They're kind of dull or not as and not shiny. They do not really have red fruits. They have that deep, dark black fruit, and they have very inconspicuous green flowers. The last plant that I'm going to mention in brief this evening is Himalayan balsam or Impatiens glandulifera. It is a early detection, what we call it, early detection rapid response plant, where we find them and you try to encourage people to get in there and get it out before it takes hold. And it is quite widely, it is an early detections plant, but it is becoming quite prevalent here in the mid-coast. So for those of you listening, Knox-Lincoln, Waldo, Kennebec counties, I would definitely encourage you to keep your eye out for this if you don't know it yet. We have an orange touch-me-not, which is native. It has rounded leaves, orange flowers, but can grow, but also hollow stems, also grows as an annual, grows quickly, that same sort of springing action for the seeds pods to spread their seeds. They have hollow stems. They grow more prolifically in moist sites, though they can be in sort of moderate moisture and do well, particularly dry, not so much. They will grow in sun or shade, and but they are very easy to pull. We can hand pull those. You can compost them in black plastic bags, kind of let them essentially burn in the sun in the black bags, and they will dispose of quite readily. So I have been working on a couple of sites and talking with a number of people in the area, and the general consensus is it's about a 7-year cycle of consistent pulling, once or twice a year at least on the site. And then because the seeds stay viable in the soil for several years, but that seems to be a general rule of thumb that you can get ahead of them after that 7-year mark. So now that you've identified that you have one or more of the species Louisa and I introduced to you in this program, how would you go about addressing them? The first, so we always think about integrated pest management. A weed is a plant out of place. An invasive plant is something that's wreaking havoc in the landscape economically, biologically, etc. And so we try to look at kind of an integrated approach. What can we do now? What can we do later? And what can give us the biggest bang for the buck or bring back that biodiversity sooner? One way, we've got 3 sort of general approaches in terms of mechanical approach, and the first being biological. One of the problems with invasive species is that they don't come with their natural predators. So we have to sort of seek out through science and figure out, is there something specific that feeds on this plant that doesn't feed on anything else, so it's exclusive to this plant. We learned that there's this biological control, such as this beetle for purple loosestrife. We're dealing with woody plants this evening and woodland plants, so that's not, we don't have that type of biological control for the species we've mentioned, but we do have goats, and goats can be a very effective herbivore, and they are fairly non-specific eaters. I don't know I am not a goat specialist by any means, but there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research on the use of goats for a number of woody plant invasive plant management. But again, they have their own issues because now you have to manage another living thing, and you have to house them, feed them, move them from one site to the next. And but if you've got a local goat farmer willing to help you out, that can be a very effective means of reducing biomass fairly quickly. The next is cultural. And here you see an image of plants, our plant sale orders packed and ready to go for our annual fundraiser. Cultural is really something that I consider very integrated in how we manage, in that we're kind of essentially trying to beat invasives at their own game by planting or overplanting, densely planting native plants in and amongst the native plants. And really, for me, that comes after a biological, chemical, or physical approach to the management. So you would kind of come at it cutting them down or bringing in the goats, and then interplanting quite heavily as a means to shade out any seedlings that would emerge. Next is physical, which is probably the most common and or will be integrated with chemical controls. And that is cutting with the use of loppers, pruners, saws, pulling with weed wrenches, or digging with spades and shovels. Of course, what do you do with all of that biomass once you've cut and pulled and piled up, especially anything with flowers and fruits or exposed roots that you can possibly attach and spread somewhere else, is to generate a huge pile and or small piles and burn them to stay ahead of them, or you put a large pile like we did here at Mary Spring Nature Center, and we invited for donation the Camden Fire Department to control burn the site, which they were happy to do for us. The other approach for integrated pest management is chemical. If you want to stick to just mechanical, that's totally fine. When you're looking at multiple properties or a very large infestation, or sometimes even a really small but dense, intense infestation, such as something like Japanese knotweed, which is very aggressive, has really thick rhizomes, can lay dormant for years. We can often recommend using a chemical approach to help bring back that, to beat back that invasive plant and to bring back the biodiversity, kind of the rate of reward, risk versus reward factor. We think that the reward and the return of the biodiversity can outweigh the judicious use of chemicals. So the first is foliar, and that is applying directly to the leaves with a sprayer. And that will either be a suffocant or a desiccant. It'll either sort of dry it out, or it will suffocate. It will stop the photosynthesis from occurring in either case. The next is a basal bark treatment, where you usually add a specially selected dye to the solution so that you can see which plants you've treated. It's not generally as recommended for multi-stemmed plants like shrubby honeysuckle and autumn olive, because you've got so much biomass. You really need to treat around all the bark and around all the bases of each stem. So better for some more of a treatment, etc. And then you just let the plant kind of die a slow but not slow death, and they will fall down, and you can cut and remove them later, or you can cut them right away and create that burn pile, if you will, and do a cut stem treatment and use a concentrated solution with a paintbrush, put it directly on the freshly cut stem. It'll be absorbed systemically and hopefully will not resprout. But again, if you use a little bit of dye, specially formulated to be used in conjunction with the chemical. You can see which stems you've treated and kind of go back and work around the treated areas when resprouts occur. So some tips and techniques if you're new to this invasive plant management or haven't done a lot of it. From somebody who's sort of been there, done that, I would always recommend long sleeves and pants. There's a lot of lightweight materials, bamboo and all of the hiking weight, light hiking weight materials that you can use. Remember, things like barberry and autumn olive and others can have thorns. Some of them can be phototoxic and cause irritations to your skin. Be sure to often recommend wearing gloves. You're pulling and tearing and cutting and dragging. And so just, you'll know that a cotton glove isn't going to be the appropriate thing. If you're pulling barberry or autumn olive, you're going to want a thick canvas or leather glove. Again, pulling out all that material and dragging it, keeping your hair back, wearing sturdy boots for trekking through this terrain. And obviously hats serve a purpose in terms of keeping the sun or rain out, but I actually like hats as much for giving me a barrier between said plant and my face. So it might bounce off your brim before it bounces off your nose. Tools, always think about the right tool for the job. Sometimes it requires a little investment. Do you have species that would come out readily with a weed wrench? Saves a lot of back labor. Or if you are dealing with 2-inch caliper and larger, some hand saws for the job, or a small chainsaw might be the appropriate approach. If you've got smaller, thinner, 2-inch and smaller, a combination of loppers and pruners. Always keep some sharpener or some steel wool to keep the edges sharp and clean. And I always recommend sort of the disposable alcohol wipes to keep your tools clean. And if you don't know how to use them, I always particularly think of this around saws. Some saws are cutting on the push, some saws will cut on the pull, and some saws will cut on the push and pull. And it's really important to make sure that you know how to use the tools you've bought so that you are not wasting a lot of energy or effort. So on behalf of Louisa and myself and the Knox-Lincoln Soil Water Conservation District, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you've can properly identify a couple more plants on your property. And this video will be available on our website, probably the Maine Forest Service website, as part of their 101 series that we're joining you here for tonight. And I wanted to make sure that you were all aware that the Maine Invasive Plants Field Guide was put out by the Maine Natural Areas Program. Is an excellent field resource. It's weatherproofed, so you can drop it in the mud or bring it out in the rain, and it's fairly indestructible. And it can be purchased online on our website for $24.95. Maine Natural Areas, Maine Forest Service may have them as well, and plus shipping and handling and tax. And they are an excellent field guide. Nancy Olmsted, who has sadly left the Maine Natural Areas Program, but happily joined the Nature Conservancy as conservation biologist. So she's still around and working in the field here in Maine, and put this together with a number of colleagues across the state, and it's an excellent resource. So again, thank you so much. Our contact information is here. If you prefer to call by phone, you can reach us at 596-2040. Thank you.